Josephine Greene stared at her reflection in the slightly warped mirror, her honey-colored hair pinned in an elegant updo that had taken nearly an hour to perfect. The faint lines of exhaustion beneath her eyes told a different story than the carefully arranged curls framing her face. 25 proposals of marriage in 3 years, and 25 rejections not by her but of her. In Walla Walla, Washington, 1876, that made her something of a local curiosity. The spring sunshine spilled through the curtains of her modest bedroom as she adjusted the lace collar of her blue calico dress. The familiar sounds of Main Street filtered through her open window, wagon wheels on packed dirt, horses nickering, shopkeepers calling greetings. Another day in the growing frontier town that had been her home since childhood. Josephine, Mrs. Wilson is here for her fitting, her mother called from downstairs. With one last glance at her reflection, Josephine straightened her shoulders and descended the stairs to the front parlor of their home, which doubled as their dressmaking shop. Greene's fine apparel had been her father's dream for her mother before consumption took him 5 years ago. Now it was just the two of them, making a respectable living with needle and thread. Mrs. Wilson, the banker's wife, stood in the center of the room, her considerable frame draped in half-pinned green silk. "There you are, dear. I was just telling your mother this dress simply must be ready for the Founders' Day celebration. Everyone who's anyone will attend. Of course, Mrs. Wilson." Josephine retrieved her pincushion. "Please stand still while I make the final adjustments," as Josephine knelt to mark the hemline. Mrs. Wilson continued chattering. "My nephew arrives on tomorrow's stage, you know, Harvard-educated and quite handsome. I've told him all about the charming young ladies of Walla Walla." She paused meaningfully. "Those still available, of course." Josephine felt her mother's concerned glance but kept her eyes fixed on her work. Another potential suitor. Another inevitable disappointment. "How lovely," she murmured, sliding a pin into place. "Yes, well," Mrs. Wilson sniffed. "I've invited several eligible young ladies to dinner on Saturday. You and your mother are welcome to attend as well, though I understand if you're occupied with work." The invitation was obligatory at best. Mrs. Wilson, like most of Walla Walla's society, had given up on Josephine's prospects long ago. She was too outspoken, too independent, too plain, too bookish. The reasons varied depending on who was doing the rejecting, but the outcome remained the same. "Thank you for thinking of us," her mother replied smoothly. "We'll check our appointments calendar." After Mrs. Wilson departed in a cloud of expensive perfume, Josephine's mother, Eleanor Greene, turned to her daughter with concern etching her still handsome face. "You don't have to attend another one of these matchmaking dinners, Josie. Heaven knows we've endured enough of them." Josephine managed a smile. "And missed the opportunity to scandalize another Eastern gentleman with my opinions on women's suffrage. What would I do with my Saturday evening instead?" Eleanor didn't return the smile. "I worry about you, darling. Not about your prospects, you're perfectly capable of caring for yourself, but about your heart. Each rejection seems to build another wall around it. My heart is quite intact, Mother." Josephine busied herself tidying the workroom. "Besides, we have 3 wedding dresses to complete before month's end. Romance is a luxury we can't afford right now." Later that afternoon, Josephine walked to Miller's General Store for thread and buttons. Main Street bustled with activity, freight wagons loaded with supplies for outlying ranches, children running errands, ladies window shopping. The town had grown considerably in recent years, the railroad bringing prosperity and new faces to the valley. Inside Miller's, she nodded politely to Mrs. Thornton and her daughters, who were examining fabric bolts and whispering behind their gloved hands as Josephine passed. Their not quite hushed voices carried clearly. "Poor thing. Did you hear Richard Bennett withdrew his offer after that disastrous picnic? Mother says no man wants a wife who argues politics at social gatherings. Such a shame. She's not entirely without charm, but so difficult." Josephine pretended not to hear, selecting her buttons with deliberate care. The bell above the door jingled as someone entered, bringing with it a momentary hush in conversation. Curious, she glanced up. The man who'd entered stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe before he ducked slightly to enter. Unlike the typical town gentleman in his Sunday best, this man wore practical range clothes, a worn leather vest over a clean but simple shirt, denim pants tucked into scuffed boots. His dark brown hat, pushed back slightly, revealed a sun-bronzed face with a strong jaw partially obscured by a neatly trimmed beard. "Afternoon, Mr. Miller," the stranger said, his voice deep but quiet. "Blake Irwin," Miller exclaimed, coming around the counter to shake the man's hand. "Didn't expect to see you in town for another month. Cattle drive finished early." "Yes, sir. Brought the herd in yesterday. Just need supplies before heading back to the ranch." Josephine tried not to stare, but something about the man's calm presence drew her attention. He wasn't conventionally handsome like the town dandies who frequented her mother's shop, but there was a quiet strength in his bearing that commanded notice. When he happened to glance in her direction, she quickly returned her attention to the buttons. Blake Irwin. The name sounded vaguely familiar, possibly one of the ranchers from the foothills east of town. She'd heard his name mentioned occasionally, but knew little about him beyond his reputation as a competent cattleman who kept to himself. Mr. Miller was still chatting. "You staying in town for the Founders' Day celebration next weekend?" "Wasn't planning on it." Blake Irwin's voice remained low, as if uncomfortable being the center of attention. "Should consider it. Good for business connections. The whole town turns out." Josephine gathered her purchases and approached the counter, waiting patiently while Miller tallied Blake's order: coffee, flour, sugar, ammunition, and several other ranch staples. When Blake stepped aside, nodding politely to Josephine, she placed her buttons and thread on the counter. "Miss Greene," Miller greeted her. "How's your mother keeping?" "Very well, thank you. We've been quite busy with summer orders." "I imagine so. Ladies want to look their finest for the celebration." He glanced between her and Blake. "Miss Greene, have you met Blake Irwin?" "Owns the Crescent Ridge Ranch about 15 miles east." "Blake, this is Miss Josephine Greene. She and her mother run the dressmaking shop down the street." Blake Irwin removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Miss Greene." His blue eyes met hers briefly before looking away, as if uncomfortable with direct contact. "Mr. Irwin," she responded with a polite nod. "I believe we supplied curtains for your ranch house some years back, though I don't recall meeting you personally." "Yes, madam, 4 years ago." "They've held up well." Something about his direct, unembellished way of speaking intrigued her. No flowery compliments or forced conversation, just simple acknowledgement. After paying for her purchases, Josephine bid them good day and exited the store, feeling a curious sense of being watched. When she glanced back through the window, she caught Blake Irwin looking in her direction before he quickly returned his attention to Mr. Miller. The following days passed in a blur of activity. Josephine and her mother worked long hours completing dresses for the Founders' Day celebration, their fingers calloused and pricked despite years of experience. When Saturday evening arrived, Alina insisted they attend Mrs. Wilson's dinner party. "We've worked ourselves to the bone this week," she argued. "A proper meal that we don't have to cook ourselves will do us both good." Reluctantly, Josephine donned one of her better dresses, a dove-gray silk with subtle blue embroidery she'd added herself. The color complemented her eyes, though she had no illusions about impressing Mrs. Wilson's Harvard-educated nephew. The Wilson home stood among the finest in Walla Walla, a 2-story brick structure with ornate trim and manicured gardens. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated rooms filled with imported furniture and artwork, all designed to showcase the family's prosperity and Eastern refinement. As Josephine had expected, the dinner party consisted primarily of the town's wealthiest families and their eligible daughters, all seemingly chosen for their quiet demeanor and impeccable social graces. Wilson's nephew, Arthur, proved to be exactly as advertised: handsome, well-spoken, and utterly conventional in his thinking. During dinner, Josephine found herself seated between Arthur and the mayor's son, with conversation flowing around her like water around a stone. She contributed where appropriate, but found little of interest in discussions about Eastern fashions and Harvard's rowing team. "Miss Greene," Arthur eventually addressed her directly, "my aunt mentioned you're a dressmaker. It must be fascinating work, creating beautiful things for beautiful ladies." His smile revealed perfect teeth and minimal genuine interest. "It's satisfying work, yes," Josephine replied, "though I find the technical challenges more engaging than the aesthetic results sometimes." Arthur's brow furrowed slightly. "Technical challenges? I wouldn't have thought dressmaking particularly technical. No, calculating fabric requirements for complex patterns requires considerable mathematical skill. And understanding how different textiles behave under various conditions is essentially applied science." She smiled pleasantly. "But perhaps I've misunderstood what you consider technical." The conversation around them had quieted, other guests listening with expressions ranging from amusement to disapproval. Arthur cleared his throat. "I meant no offense. I simply hadn't considered dressmaking in those terms before." "Few do," Josephine acknowledged. "Just as few consider the mathematical principles behind a well-constructed building or bridge to be beautiful in themselves." Mrs. Wilson intervened smoothly. "Speaking of beautiful buildings, Arthur was just telling us about the new university library at Harvard. Weren't you, dear?" The conversation shifted away, and Josephine caught her mother's resigned expression from across the table. Another potential suitor who would never call. Another evening wasted on social niceties that felt increasingly hollow. After dinner, the guests moved to the parlor for music and conversation. Josephine found herself near the window, watching darkness settle over the town below. The distant sounds of rowdier entertainment drifted up from the saloons near the rail yard: piano music, laughter, occasional shouts. Two different worlds existing side by side. "Miss Greene," a female voice interrupted her thoughts. "I wonder if I might have a word." Turning, Josephine found herself facing Catherine Reynolds, the town physician's daughter and one of the few women in Walla Walla whom Josephine genuinely respected. Catherine had trained as a nurse back east and now assisted her father in his practice. "Of course, Miss Reynolds." Catherine glanced around before speaking quietly. "I'm organizing a small meeting next Tuesday evening. A gathering of like-minded women to discuss the suffrage movement and other matters of mutual interest. I thought perhaps you might wish to attend." Josephine felt a spark of genuine interest for the first time that evening. "I would very much. Where will you meet?" "My father's office at 7 o'clock. He's graciously given us the use of his waiting room." Catherine smiled. "We try to keep it somewhat discreet. Not everyone appreciates our discussions." "I understand completely." Josephine returned the smile. "Thank you for including me. I'll be there." As the evening wore on, Josephine found opportunities to speak with Catherine about her nursing work, a far more engaging conversation than anything else the party had offered. By the time she and her mother departed, she'd all but forgotten Arthur Wilson's polite dismissal of her occupation. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, promising another beautiful spring day. Josephine rose early, as was her habit, and decided to visit the Sunday market before church services. With her mother still asleep, she left a brief note and slipped out into the quiet streets. The market occupied the town square every Sunday morning, local farmers bringing fresh produce and homemade goods to sell before church. Josephine enjoyed these early hours when the town felt peaceful and full of possibility. She was examining a basket of fresh eggs when a familiar deep voice spoke nearby. 2 dozen, please, Mrs. Pearson." Glancing up, she was surprised to see Blake Irwin standing at the next stall, carefully selecting eggs that the elderly Mrs. Pearson placed in a cloth-lined basket. "These should last you the week, Mr. Irwin," Mrs. Pearson said. "Though a man living alone needs a woman's touch around that big house of yours, my granddaughter Mary is visiting next month, pretty as a picture and an excellent cook." Blake's expression remained neutral. "I'm sure she's lovely, madam. My housekeeper manages just fine for now." He paid for the eggs and turned, nearly colliding with Josephine. "Miss Greene." He tipped his hat, recognition lighting his eyes. "Good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Irwin. I didn't expect to see you in town again so soon." He shifted the basket to his other arm. "Supplies I forgot, and the blacksmith promised my plow blade would be ready." He hesitated, then added, "Are you marketing alone?" "Yes, my mother appreciates sleeping past dawn on Sundays." Josephine found herself smiling at his direct manner. "And you?" "Still not staying for Founder's Day?" "No, madam. Too much work waiting at the ranch." He glanced toward the church, where the bell would soon ring for services. "Will you be attending service this morning?" "Yes, my mother will meet me there," he nodded, seeming to consider something. "May I walk with you? I'm headed that direction myself." The offer surprised her. "Of course, if you wish." They walked in companionable silence for a few moments, Blake adjusting his long stride to match hers. Unlike most men of her acquaintance, he seemed comfortable with quiet, making no effort to fill the air with idle chatter. "I heard what those ladies said about you in the store," he said suddenly, his eyes fixed ahead. "The other day," Josephine nearly missed a step. "I beg your pardon." "The Thornton women, gossiping?" His jaw tightened visibly beneath his beard. It wasn't right. Heat rose in Josephine's cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the unexpected acknowledgement. "People talk. I've grown accustomed to it." "Doesn't make it right." He shifted the basket again. "Folks should mind their own business." "Is that your philosophy, Mr. Irwin, minding your own business?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Generally, though here I am not minding it." Josephine laughed softly. "So you are. Why is that?" He considered for several steps before answering. "Don't like unfairness, I suppose, judging people without knowing them." They had reached the white-steepled church where townspeople were already gathering on the steps. Blake stopped at the edge of the churchyard. "This is where I leave you, Miss Greene. I've matters to attend to before heading back to the ranch." "You're not staying for services?" "No, madam." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than was strictly proper. "Enjoy your Sunday, Miss Greene." With that, he tipped his hat again and turned, striding purposefully toward the livery stable at the end of the street. Josephine watched him go, puzzled by the brief interaction and her own inexplicable disappointment at his departure. Her mother appeared beside her. "Was that Blake Irwin I saw you walking with?" "Yes. We met at the market and walked this far together." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. I don't believe I've ever seen him at a social gathering in town. Very much keeps to himself from what I hear." "So everyone says." Josephine took her mother's arm. "Shall we go in? I believe Reverend Phillips preaches on patience today." "Something we both could use more of," Elena replied with a knowing smile. The days leading up to Founder's Day passed in a flurry of last-minute fittings and adjustments. On Tuesday evening, Josephine made her way to Dr. Reynolds' office for Catherine's meeting, curious about what to expect. He found 8 women gathered in the waiting room, ranging in age from Catherine's 19 years to the 60-something postmistress, Mrs. Grant. Some faces she recognized immediately: the schoolteacher, Miss Winters, the librarian, Miss Collins, Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the boarding house near the rail yard. Others were less familiar. Catherine welcomed her warmly. "Ladies, I believe most of you know Josephine Greene." "Josephine, please join us." The meeting proved to be exactly what Catherine had promised: thoughtful discussion of women's suffrage, educational opportunities, and other issues affecting women in the territory. For 2 hours, Josephine participated in the most stimulating conversation she'd had in months, finding herself among women who shared many of her views. Washington Territory almost granted women the vote 4 years ago, Mrs. Abernathy noted. "The bill passed both houses but was vetoed by the governor. They'll try again, mark my words. And when they do, we should be prepared to support it publicly," added Miss Winters. Education is the key. Many women don't understand how the vote would benefit them. As the meeting concluded, Catherine approached Josephine. I'm so glad you came. We meet monthly, though sometimes more frequently when there's news to discuss. Thank you for including me. It's refreshing to speak openly about these matters without being considered difficult. Catherine smiled knowingly. I've heard the whispers about both of us, Josephine, too educated for her own good, will never find a husband with those opinions, as if marriage were the only measure of a woman's worth. You don't wish to marry? Josephine asked. I didn't say that. I merely believe marriage should be a partnership of equals, not a surrender of one's identity. Catherine gathered her papers. Unfortunately, few men in Walla Walla seem to share that view. Josephine thought unexpectedly of Blake Irwin and his quiet defense of her at the market. Perhaps they exist but aren't as vocal about their beliefs. Perhaps. Catherine looked skeptical. Will you attend the Founders' Day celebration on Saturday? Yes, Mother and I will have a small display of our work. Will you be there? Of course. Father insists it's good for his practice to be seen at community events. I'll look for you. Josephine walked home through the quiet evening streets, her mind full of the discussions from the meeting. For the first time in months, she felt genuinely hopeful not about romantic prospects, but about finding like-minded friends in Walla Walla. Saturday dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for the outdoor celebration. The town square had been transformed overnight, with bunting decorating every available surface and tables set up around the perimeter. A temporary wooden platform stood in the center, where the mayor would give his annual speech on the town's founding and growth. Josephine and Alina arrived early to set up their display a selection of their finest work, including a wedding dress that had taken 3 months to complete, with thousands of tiny seed pearls sewn into the bodice. By mid-morning, the square was filled with townspeople in their finest clothes, merchants hawking wares, and children racing between adults with sticky candy in hand. Josephine, your blue walking suit is exquisite, Mrs. Thompson exclaimed, examining their display. Such fine detail work on the cuffs. I must order something similar for my trip to Seattle next month. We'd be delighted to design something for you, Alina replied, while Josephine made notes about Mrs. Thompson's preferences and measurements. The day progressed pleasantly, with steady interest in their work and several orders placed. Around noon, the mayor called for attention and began his speech, which everyone knew would last at least 30 minutes. Josephine used the opportunity to step away from their table. I'll fetch us some lemonade, she told her mother, weaving through the crowd toward the refreshment stand. As she waited in line, she overheard a conversation between 2 ranch hands behind her. Irwin actually came to town for this shindig. Never thought I'd see the day. Where? Don't see him. Over by the hardware display, talking to Peterson. Guess he's finally deciding to be sociable. Josephine couldn't help glancing in the direction indicated. Sure enough, Blake Irwin stood across the square, deep in conversation with the hardware merchant. He'd made concessions to the occasion, wearing a clean dark blue shirt and what appeared to be new denim pants, though he still looked distinctly different from the town gentlemen in their suits and ties. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his eyes finding hers across the crowded square. He nodded slightly in acknowledgement, and Josephine returned the gesture before turning back to the lemonade vendor. When she returned to their table with drinks, her mother was chatting with Catherine Reynolds. Miss Reynolds was just telling me about your Tuesday meeting, Alina said. It sounds quite interesting. It was, Josephine confirmed, handing her mother a lemonade, though I suspect not everyone in Walla Walla would approve of our discussion topics, Catherine laughed. Precisely why we're discreet. Oh, look, the dancing is about to begin. The town band had assembled near the platform, tuning instruments for the traditional dancing that followed the mayor's speech. Young men in their Sunday best were already approaching young women, securing partners for the first dance. Josephine. Arthur Wilson appeared beside their table, looking uncomfortable but determined. I wonder if I might have the honor of the first dance. Surprised, Josephine glanced at Catherine, who raised her eyebrows slightly. That's very kind, Mr. Wilson, but please, he interrupted. My aunt insists I've been unconscionably rude. I'd like to make amends. Josephine recognized the situation for what it was, an obligatory gesture prompted by Mrs. Wilson's sense of propriety. Still, causing a scene would only create more gossip. Very well, she agreed, setting down her lemonade. One dance. Arthur led her to the area cleared for dancing, his posture stiff and formal. As they took their positions for the Virginia reel, he attempted conversation. I hope you've been well since our dinner, Miss Greene. Quite well, thank you. My aunt speaks highly of your dressmaking skills. She says you're the finest seamstress in the territory. My mother and I work as a team, but thank you for the compliment. The music began, saving them from further stilted conversation as they moved through the figures of the dance. Josephine went through the motions automatically, her mind elsewhere. When the dance ended, she thanked Arthur and turned to leave the floor. Wait, he said, catching her elbow. I wanted to ask, that is, my aunt suggested perhaps you might accompany me to church tomorrow. And afterward for Sunday dinner. The invitation, clearly prompted by Mrs. Wilson's machinations, held all the enthusiasm of a man facing a dental extraction. Josephine almost felt sorry for him. That's very kind, Mr. Wilson, but I must decline. My mother and I have standing commitments after services. She offered a polite smile. I'm sure there are many young ladies who would be delighted to accept, however. Relief flashed across his features before he masked it with practiced disappointment. Perhaps another time then, perhaps. They both knew there wouldn't be another time. As Josephine made her way back through the crowd, she noticed Blake Irwin standing near the edge of the dancing area, watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. On impulse, she altered her course to approach him. Mr. Irwin. I'm surprised to see you at the celebration after all, he turned, something like pleasure flickering in his eyes. Miss Greene. Peterson convinced me he had plow parts I'd regret missing if I didn't come today. He nodded toward the hardware display. Turns out he was right. So you came for plow parts, not dancing and speeches. She found herself smiling at his practicality. Definitely not for speeches. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. Dancing? Well, not much call for that skill on a cattle ranch. You don't dance, Mr. Irwin. He shifted his weight, suddenly looking boyishly uncomfortable. Didn't say that, just out of practice. Josephine was struck by a sudden impulse, reckless and possibly inappropriate, but irresistible nonetheless. The next set is a simple waltz, I believe. Perhaps you'd care to practice. Blake's eyes widened slightly, clearly caught off guard by her invitation. For a moment she thought he might refuse, but then he straightened his shoulders. I'd be honored, Miss Greene, though I should warn you about your toes. I'll risk them. As the band struck up a waltz, Blake offered his arm and led her back to the dancing area. Around them, Josephine was aware of curious glances and whispered comments. Blake Irwin dancing was apparently as rare as snow in July. He placed his hand properly at her waist, took her other hand in his, and after a moment's hesitation, began to move. Despite his warning, he danced competently, if a bit stiffly at first. As they circled the floor, he gradually relaxed, his movements becoming more natural. You dance very well for someone out of practice, Mr. Irwin. My mother insisted all her sons learn, said it was a necessary skill for gentlemen. His expression softened at the memory. She'd have been disappointed to know how rarely I've used the lessons. Your mother is no longer living. No, she passed 10 years ago, my father 3 years after. I'm sorry. My father died 5 years ago, consumption, Blake nodded, understanding in his eyes. Hard loss. The simple acknowledgement, free from platitudes, touched Josephine more deeply than elaborate expressions of sympathy ever had. They continued dancing, the initial awkwardness between them fading with each turn around the floor. People are staring, Josephine noted, glimpsing Mrs. Wilson's astonished expression as they waltzed past. Let them, Blake replied, his voice low but firm. Not their business. The dance ended too soon. Blake escorted her properly back to her mother's table, where Alina watched with undisguised curiosity. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Greene." He bowed slightly. "Mrs. Greene, your display is most impressive." "Thank you, Mr. Irwin," Alina smiled warmly. "We rarely see you in town. How is your ranch faring this season?" "Well enough. Good spring rains, cattle are healthy." He glanced at Josephine. "I should return to my business with Peterson." "Good day, ladies." As he walked away, Alina turned to her daughter with raised eyebrows. "Blake Irwin dancing in public. I believe I've just witnessed a minor miracle." "He dances quite well," Josephine said, watching his tall figure move through the crowd. "Indeed. And he seemed remarkably comfortable with you for a man known to avoid female company." Alina's shrewd eyes studied her daughter's face. "Is there something you haven't mentioned about your recent encounters?" "Nothing significant. We've spoken a few times. He seems different from most men in town." "Different can be good." Alina patted her hand. "Now help me with Mrs. Henderson's order." "She's changed her mind about the trim again." The celebration continued into early evening, with more dancing, games for the children, and abundant food. Josephine caught glimpses of Blake throughout the afternoon but had no opportunity to speak with him again. When she and her mother finally packed up their display as twilight fell, she found herself scanning the dispersing crowd, feeling an unfamiliar disappointment when she didn't see him. "Looking for someone?" her mother asked innocently. "Just seeing who's still about," Josephine replied, knowing her mother wasn't fooled. They walked home in comfortable silence, each carrying a portion of their display materials. The streets were quieter now, most families having returned home for supper or moved to the saloons for continued celebration. "He's a good man, you know," Alina said suddenly. "Blake Irwin, your father thought highly of him." Josephine nearly missed a step. "Father knew Mr. Irwin. They weren't close friends, but your father respected him. Blake was just starting his ranch when your father became ill. He brought us venison that winter when money was tight and refused payment." Alina smiled at the memory, said he had more than he could eat. "Your father said a man's true character shows in how he treats others when no one's watching." "I didn't know. Blake isn't one to remind people of his good deeds." Alina adjusted her bundle. "Or to participate in town gossip. Perhaps that's why he seems different to you." Josephine considered this as they approached their home. "Why has he never married, do you think? He must be in his 30s. 34, I believe. As for why?" Alina shrugged. "Not everyone finds the right person at the right time. And some men prefer solitude to settling for the wrong match." The following weeks brought a flurry of work as summer approached. Josephine attended another of Catherine's meetings, finding herself increasingly passionate about the ideas discussed. Between work and her new intellectual pursuits, she had little time to dwell on Blake Irwin, though he occasionally appeared in her thoughts. In early June, a package arrived at their shop, a bolt of fine imported wool in a rich burgundy color, with a note addressed to Josephine. "Miss Greene, I understand this material is difficult to obtain locally. My cattle buyer in Portland secured it at my request. I recall you mentioned admiring this shade when we spoke at Founders Day. No obligation attached. Respectfully, Blake Irwin." Josephine stared at the note, trying to remember when she'd mentioned burgundy wool to Blake. Then she recalled commenting on a lady's cloak as they had danced, a passing remark about the rich color being perfect for winter garments, but nearly impossible to find in Walla Walla. "What is it, dear?" Alina asked, noticing her daughter's expression. Wordlessly, Josephine handed her the note. Alina read it, her eyebrows rising. "Well, this is certainly unexpected. I can't accept it," Josephine said immediately. "It's too expensive and people would talk. People always talk." Alina examined the wool, rubbing it between experienced fingers. "Excellent quality, must have cost a small fortune. All the more reason to return it." "Perhaps." Alina handed the note back. "Though it says no obligation attached, a gift between friends isn't improper." "We're hardly friends. We've spoken 3 times, 3 memorable times apparently." Alina smiled gently. Why not accept it as intended? You can always make something for yourself from a portion and use the rest for client orders. We'd credit him with the donation. Josephine ran her hand over the luxurious material, torn between practical desire for the rare wool and concern about what accepting might imply. I should at least thank him properly. Of course. A note would be appropriate, or perhaps a visit to his ranch, Mother. With me as chaperone, naturally. Alina's eyes twinkled. We could deliver those curtains for the Peterson farmhouse. It's in the same direction. 2 days later, Josephine found herself in their small buggy beside her mother, traveling the east road out of Walla Walla toward Crescent Ridge Ranch. She'd written a polite note of thanks, but had been persuaded by her mother's practical argument that the Petersons' curtains did need delivering, and one trip served both purposes. The journey took nearly 3 hours, the road winding through increasingly hilly terrain as they left the valley. When they crested a rise and saw the ranch spread below them, Josephine was struck by its beauty, a substantial 2-story house nestled against the backdrop of a pine forest, with well-maintained outbuildings, corrals, and a small orchard. Several streams crisscrossed the property and cattle dotted the green pastures. It's lovely, she murmured. More impressive than I expected, Alina agreed. Blake has done well for himself. As they approached the house, a weathered man in his 60s emerged from a nearby barn, watching their approach with curiosity. When they stopped in the yard, he ambled over. "Afternoon, ladies. Can I help you?" "We're looking for Mr. Irwin," Alina explained. "I'm Alina Greene, and this is my daughter, Josephine. We've brought a package for him." Recognition dawned on the man's face. "The dressmaker's from town. I'm Hank Simmons, ranch foreman." He touched his hat respectfully. "Blake's out checking the north pasture. Should be back shortly if you'd care to wait." "Thank you, Mr. Simmons. We'd appreciate that." Hank helped them down from the buggy and led them to the house, calling for Mrs. Weaver as they entered. A plump, gray-haired woman appeared from what Josephine assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well now, visitors, come in, come in. I'm Martha Weaver, housekeeper." She ushered them into a surprisingly comfortable parlor. "Let me fetch some tea. You must be parched after that drive." While Mrs. Weaver bustled about, Josephine took in her surroundings. The parlor was simply but tastefully furnished with solid pieces that spoke of quality rather than fashion. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with a surprising variety of volumes: history, agriculture, poetry, and fiction. A large desk near the window held neatly stacked papers and correspondence. "Blake keeps a nice home," Mrs. Weaver commented, returning with a tea tray. "Always been particular about things being orderly, not like some bachelor establishments I've seen." "How long have you worked here, Mrs. Weaver?" Alina asked, accepting a cup. "Going on 8 years now. My Harold, that's my husband, he's the gardener and handyman. We have rooms over the kitchen." She poured Josephine's tea. "Blake was just a young man when he hired us, building this place from nothing but determination and hard work." "The ranch seems quite prosperous," Josephine observed. "It is now, wasn't always so." Mrs. Weaver settled into a chair. "First few years were lean. Blake wouldn't take on debt, insisted on building slowly with cash on hand. Lived in a one-room cabin while this house was being built. Some called him foolish, but look now, one of the most successful ranches in the county, and not a penny owed to anyone." The sound of horses in the yard interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Weaver rose to look out the window. "That's him now. Let me go tell him you're here." Left alone momentarily, Alina gave Josephine a significant look. Debt-free at 34, with a successful ranch and a reputation for integrity. Quite remarkable. "Mother, please. We're here to deliver curtains and a thank-you note, not to arrange a marriage." "Of course, dear. I'm merely making an observation." Before Josephine could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway and Blake appeared in the doorway. He'd clearly come directly from working. His shirt showed signs of dust, and his boots were mud-spattered. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, he looked entirely in his element. "Mrs. Greene, Miss Greene. Surprise and pleasure mingled in his expression. This is unexpected. Forgive the intrusion, Alina said. We were delivering curtains to the Peterson farm and thought we might stop to thank you properly for your generous gift. Blake's eyes met Josephine's. The wool arrived safely then? Yes, it's beautiful, far too generous but very much appreciated. Josephine handed him the note she'd written. I wanted to thank you personally. No thanks necessary. He accepted the note anyway, tucking it into his pocket without reading it. I'm only sorry you made such a journey. A return note would have sufficed. Nonsense, Alina declared. It's a lovely drive and we rarely get beyond town limits. Besides, Josephine was curious to see your ranch. Mother, Josephine felt heat rising to her cheeks. Blake's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. Then I'm glad you came. Would you like to see more of the property before you return? The view from the ridge behind the house is worth the short walk. I would enjoy that, Josephine said, finding herself genuinely interested. Excellent. Let me clean up a bit first. Mrs. Weaver can show you the garden while you wait. 20 minutes later, Blake reappeared in clean clothes, his hair still damp from washing. He escorted them through Mrs. Weaver's impressive kitchen garden to a path leading up the ridge behind the house. Though he offered his arm to both ladies for the steeper portions, Alina suddenly remembered a question she wanted to ask Mrs. Weaver and turned back, leaving Josephine and Blake to continue alone. My mother isn't usually so transparent, Josephine commented wryly as they ascended. Blake's quiet laugh surprised her. Mrs. Weaver isn't much better. She's been trying to find me a wife since she arrived. A common occupation for women of a certain age, it seems. Indeed. He helped her over a fallen log, his hand strong and steady. Though in my case, her efforts usually involve nieces and cousins from Oregon, not accomplished businesswomen from town. Josephine glanced at him sharply, but his expression revealed only sincerity, not mockery. Most men wouldn't consider dressmaking a business accomplishment. Most men are fools, then. Building something from nothing takes skill and determination, whether it's a ranch or a dressmaking establishment. They reached the top of the ridge, where Blake indicated a flat boulder suitable for sitting. The view spread before them was breathtaking rolling hills giving way to mountains in the distance, the ranch buildings looking like toys below, and the winding ribbon of road leading back toward Walla Walla. It's beautiful, Josephine said softly. I can see why you chose this land. It spoke to me. Blake remained standing, his gaze sweeping the horizon. I rode through a dozen properties before finding this one, knew immediately it was right, though everyone said I was crazy to buy such remote acreage. You proved them wrong. Eventually. He turned to look at her. Miss Greene, Josephine, please, if we're to be friends, something flashed in his eyes. Are we to be friends, then? I'd like that. I find your company refreshing. He seemed to consider the word. Not one I've been called before. You speak plainly. You listen when others talk. You don't seem concerned with impressing people or conforming to expectations. She smiled. All refreshing qualities in Walla Walla society, or lacking social graces depending on who you ask. His mouth quirked. I'm not much for parlor conversation. Yet here we are, conversing quite comfortably. Yes. He sat beside her on the boulder, leaving appropriate space between them. Here we are. For several minutes they sat in companionable silence, watching an eagle circle lazily above the valley. Josephine found herself completely at ease, a rarity in male company. May I ask why you sent the wool? She finally inquired. It was extraordinarily thoughtful but unexpected, Blake considered before answering. You mentioned wanting it. I was in a position to obtain it. He paused. And perhaps I wanted an excuse for you to think of me. The simple honesty of his answer took her breath away. No flowery declarations or practiced compliments, just straightforward truth. That's very direct. I'm not good at games or pretense, Josephine. He looked at her steadily. At my age, I know what I want and don't see the point in dancing around matters. And what is it you want, Mr. Irwin? Blake, please. He held her gaze. I want to court you properly if you're amenable. Josephine stared at him, caught completely off guard despite her mother's hints and her own growing attraction. "You can't be serious. Completely serious." His expression remained calm, though she detected a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "I've admired you from afar for some time. Recent interactions have only confirmed my initial impression." But she struggled to organize her thoughts. "You must know about my history with suitors. The entire town knows. I'm considered difficult, opinionated, unsuitable. I'm not asking the town to marry me." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I'm interested in Josephine Greene, not Walla Walla's opinion of her. You barely know me. I know enough to want to know more." He shifted slightly to face her more directly. "You're intelligent, principled, and unafraid to express your thoughts. You're kind. I've seen how you treat people regardless of their station. You're devoted to your mother and your business." He paused. "And if I may be so bold, I find you beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with fashion or convention." Josephine felt heat rising to her cheeks, both from his words and the intensity of his gaze. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything now." Blake rose, offering his hand to help her up. "Think about it. I'll call on you properly in town next Sunday if that's acceptable." She placed her hand in his, allowing him to assist her. "Yes, that would be acceptable." They walked back down the ridge in thoughtful silence, Josephine's mind whirling with unexpected possibilities. When they reached the house, Alina was waiting in the garden, engaged in animated conversation with Mrs. Weaver about preserving techniques. "There you are," Alina exclaimed. "Did you enjoy the view?" "Very much," Josephine replied, avoiding her mother's searching gaze. The journey home seemed shorter, filled with Alina's gentle but persistent questioning about their ridge-top conversation. By the time they reached Walla Walla, Josephine had shared Blake's unexpected proposal of courtship, though she kept some of his more personal comments to herself. "I knew it," Alina looked triumphant. The wool was clearly more than a friendly gesture. "Mother, please, I haven't agreed to anything yet, but you're considering it." "It wasn't a question," Josephine sighed. "Yes, I'm considering it." Though heaven knows why he would want to court someone who's been rejected by half the eligible men in the county. Because he sees what they didn't. Alina patted her daughter's hand. Value beyond conventional expectations. The following Sunday arrived with agonizing slowness. Josephine found herself distracted during the week, making uncharacteristic mistakes in her sewing and losing the thread of conversations. By Sunday morning, she was a bundle of nerves, changing her dress 3 times before settling on a simple blue gown that complemented her eyes. Church services passed in a blur, Josephine barely registering Reverend Philip's sermon on faith and patience. As they exited the church, she scanned the dispersing congregation but saw no sign of Blake. "Perhaps he changed his mind," she murmured to her mother as they walked home. "Or perhaps he's giving you space to think," Alina replied. "He said he'd call on you, not meet you at church." Sure enough, at precisely 3 o'clock that afternoon, a knock sounded at their front door. Josephine, who had been pretending to read in the parlor, nearly dropped her book. Alina, looking entirely too pleased with herself, went to answer. Blake stood on their porch, dressed in what Josephine recognized as his best clothes, a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders well, a crisp white shirt, and a string tie. He held his hat in his hands and had clearly made an effort to tame his usually unruly hair. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Greene. I've come to call on Miss Greene if she's receiving visitors." "Of course, Mr. Irwin. Please come in." Alina ushered him into the parlor where Josephine had risen to her feet. "I'll bring some refreshments." Left alone with Blake, Josephine found herself uncharacteristically tongue-tied. He seemed equally uncomfortable, his normally confident posture slightly stiff as he took the seat she indicated. "You look lovely," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Thank you, you look very—" She searched for the right word, formal. A smile tugged at his mouth. "Not my usual attire." Mrs. Weaver insisted. "Mrs. Weaver seems to have strong opinions." "She does, particularly regarding my bachelor status." His smile broadened slightly. She approves of my calling on you, by the way, says any woman who travels 3 hours to deliver a thank you note has admirable determination. Josephine laughed, tension easing between them. I suspect she and my mother would get along famously. They share similar matchmaking tendencies. Formidable allies. Blake leaned forward slightly. Have you thought about my proposal? I have. Josephine met his gaze steadily. I have questions first. Ask anything. Why now? You said you've admired me from afar for some time. What changed? Blake considered his answer carefully. I've been establishing the ranch, focused on building something sustainable. Only recently have I felt secure enough to think beyond day-to-day operations. He paused. As for why you specifically, I've watched how you handle rejection and gossip with dignity, how you continue to pursue what matters to you despite obstacles. Those qualities impress me far more than the social graces most men seem to value. And my opinions on women's rights and education, they don't concern you, why would they? Intelligent thoughts deserve expression regardless of who thinks them. He smiled slightly. Besides, a marriage without honest conversation seems terribly dull. Josephine raised an eyebrow. Marriage, we're discussing courtship, Mr. Irwin. Blake, he corrected gently. And yes, courtship is the proper first step, but I'm 34, Josephine. I'm not courting for amusement or social convention. If we suit each other, marriage would be the natural progression. His directness was both startling and refreshing. Before she could respond, Alina returned with tea and cookies, providing a momentary reprieve from the intensity of the conversation. As they enjoyed refreshments, Blake asked thoughtful questions about their business, demonstrating genuine interest in the technical aspects Josephine had mentioned at Mrs. Wilson's dinner party. When Alina tactfully excused herself to attend to some urgent correspondence, Josephine found herself alone with Blake once more. You haven't answered my question, he reminded her softly, about courtship. Josephine set down her teacup. I'm amenable to the idea. Though I think we should proceed slowly, we have much to learn about each other. Relief and pleasure crossed his features. I'd like that. May I call on you again next Sunday? Yes. She hesitated, then added, and perhaps you might attend church services beforehand. If you're not opposed to town gatherings. I'm not opposed to them, simply unaccustomed, he smiled. But for you, I'll make an exception. When Blake departed an hour later, Josephine stood at the window watching his tall figure stride down the street, a curious mixture of excitement and apprehension swirling within her. Alina appeared beside her, a knowing look on her face. Well, we're proceeding with courtship, Josephine admitted, slowly and properly, of course. Alina's expression remained neutral, though her eyes sparkled. Very sensible. The following weeks established a pattern. Blake attended church with Josephine and Alina each Sunday, enduring the curious stares and whispers with stoic dignity. Afterward, he would call at their home, sometimes bringing small, thoughtful gifts, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, fresh berries from his orchard, a carved wooden box for her sewing notions that he'd made himself during evening hours. Their conversations ranged widely, from literature to ranching techniques, from territorial politics to childhood memories. Blake proved to be well-read despite his limited formal education, with thoughtful opinions and a dry wit that emerged more frequently as their comfort with each other grew. Occasionally, they ventured beyond the parlor for walks through town or picnics by the creek. Always properly chaperoned by Alina or another respectable matron, these outings nonetheless allowed for moments of greater intimacy, a brief touch of hands, meaningful glances, the gradual narrowing of physical space between them as their emotional connection deepened. The town's reaction to their courtship ranged from bemused interest to outright skepticism. Josephine overheard snippets of conversation that alternated between surprise that Blake Irwin had finally shown interest in a woman and predictions that Josephine would soon drive him away with her difficult nature, as she had so many others. Don't they have anything better to discuss? She commented to Catherine Reynolds during one of their meetings, which Blake had encouraged her to continue attending. "You've given them their most interesting topic in months," Catherine replied with a smile. The confirmed bachelor and the woman no man could tolerate finding apparent happiness together. It contradicts everything they think they know. It's ridiculous. Blake and I simply understand each other. Precisely what frightens them. Catherine's expression grew serious. A man who values a woman's mind as much as her appearance or domestic skills threatens their comfortable assumptions about what marriage should be. If Blake can be happy with you, you mean with an opinionated, independent woman. Exactly. If he can be happy with you, then perhaps their daughters might start seeking similar relationships instead of submissive marriages. Revolutionary thinking. Despite the gossip, Blake remained unperturbed. "Let them talk," he said during one of their Sunday walks. "Their opinions change nothing between us." By late August, their courtship had progressed to the point where Blake invited Josephine and Alina to spend a weekend at Crescent Ridge. Mrs. Weaver was beside herself with excitement, preparing the guest rooms and planning elaborate meals to showcase her culinary skills. The visit allowed Josephine to see Blake in his element, confident and capable, as he showed them the operations of the ranch, introduced them to his small staff, and demonstrated the improvements he was making to increase productivity. She found herself increasingly drawn to his quiet competence and the respect he showed to everyone who worked for him, regardless of position. On Saturday afternoon, while Alina rested after the morning's tour, Blake suggested a ride to a nearby lake. With Mrs. Weaver's blessing as chaperone, she would follow in the buggy they set out on horseback. Josephine, comfortable in the side saddle Blake had procured for her use. The lake nestled in a small valley surrounded by pine trees, its clear blue waters reflecting the sky above. They dismounted near the shore, where Mrs. Weaver set up a picnic at a discreet distance, giving them privacy while remaining in sight. "It's beautiful here," Josephine said, breathing in the scent of pine and clean water. "So peaceful. One of my favorite places on the property." Blake stood beside her, closer than propriety might strictly allow but not close enough to cause scandal. "I come here to think when decisions need making, important decisions, sometimes." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Josephine, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I know we agreed to proceed slowly and I've respected that, but my feelings for you have only grown stronger with time." Her heart began to race. "Blake, please let me finish." He took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "I love you, Josephine Greene. Your mind, your spirit, your determination, everything about you. I want to share my life with you to build something meaningful together." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small box. "I'm asking if you'll marry me." Opening the box, he revealed a ring, not an ostentatious diamond, but a beautifully crafted gold band set with a deep blue sapphire that matched her eyes. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "My mother saved it for me, hoping someday I'd find a woman worthy of its history. I never thought I would until you." Josephine stared at the ring, emotions overwhelming her. After so many rejections, so many men finding her lacking in some fundamental way, here stood a man who valued her precisely for the qualities others had criticized. A man whose strength matched her own, whose integrity she respected, whose company brought her joy. "Blake," she began, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. "I need to be certain. Marriage to me won't be conventional. I have opinions. I intend to continue our business, at least in some capacity. I'll want to participate in decisions, not simply accept yours without question." "I would expect nothing less," he replied, his gaze steady. "I'm not asking you to become someone else, Josephine. I'm asking to partner with the woman you are." Tears blurred her vision, not of sorrow but of profound relief and happiness. "Then yes, I will marry you, Blake Irwin." His smile transformed his usually serious face, revealing a boyish joy that tugged at her heart. With slightly trembling hands, he slid the ring onto her finger where it fit as if made for her. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice low. Josephine nodded, suddenly unable to speak. Blake stepped closer, one hand coming to rest gently at her waist, the other lifting to touch her cheek. When his lips met hers, the tenderness of the contact brought fresh tears to her eyes. The kiss deepened slightly, remaining proper but conveying a depth of emotion that left her breathless. When they finally separated, Blake rested his forehead against hers for a moment. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me. The real me, not just the quiet rancher everyone dismisses." His thumb caressed her cheek. "And for letting me see you." From the distance, Mrs. Weaver's discreet cough reminded them of her presence. They turned to find her beaming at them, clearly having witnessed the proposal. "I take it congratulations are in order," she called, moving toward them with the picnic basket. Blake's arm remained around Josephine's waist. "They are indeed, Mrs. Weaver. Miss Greene has done me the great honor of accepting my proposal." "Well, it's about time," Mrs. Weaver exclaimed, embracing them both. "The Lord knows I've been praying for this day since you started your courtship. Wait until Mr. Weaver hears he owes me $2. He said it wouldn't happen until Christmas," Josephine laughed, leaning into Blake's solid presence. "Were we so predictable?" "Only to those who were watching closely," Mrs. Weaver replied with a wink. "Now, let's celebrate with this picnic before we return to tell your mother, Miss Greene." Alina received the news with tears of joy and a confession that she'd suspected Blake's intentions for this trip. "The way he asked specifically about your favorite colors last Sunday gave him away," she explained. "No man inquires about such details without matrimonial purpose." That evening, seated on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills in gold and crimson, Josephine and Blake discussed practical matters where they would live, how to combine their lives and work. "The ranch house has plenty of room," Blake said. "But I understand if you wish to maintain your home in town, at least initially. The business is there and your mother could come with us," Josephine suggested. "There's space for a small sewing room here and we could still accept special commissions. Perhaps not as many as before, but the most interesting ones. You'd be willing to reduce your workload?" Blake seemed surprised. "Not because you asked me to," she clarified, "but because I find myself interested in ranch operations as well. I'd like to learn more, perhaps contribute in ways beyond housekeeping." Blake's smile was warm. "I would welcome your involvement. Your organizational skills and business sense could be valuable, especially as we expand." They decided on a November wedding time enough for proper preparations, but not so distant as to require a lengthy engagement. The announcement in church the following Sunday caused the expected stir, with reactions ranging from genuine good wishes to poorly concealed surprise. "Blake Irwin and Josephine Greene," Mrs. Wilson whispered loudly enough to be overheard. "Who would have thought? After all those suitable young men she rejected." "I believe they rejected her, Agatha," her companion corrected. "Well, she gave them good reason, I'm sure, too outspoken by half." Blake, standing beside Josephine, squeezed her hand gently. "Shall I defend your honor, or would you prefer to ignore them?" "Neither," Josephine replied with a smile. "Let's simply be happy in their presence. That will confound them more than any response." In the weeks that followed, Josephine divided her time between wedding preparations, completing outstanding dress orders and regular visits to Crescent Ridge to plan modifications to the house. Blake installed bookshelves in the parlor specifically for her collection, created a spacious sewing room with excellent natural light, and added a small conservatory where Alina could pursue her interest in exotic plants. "You're making so many changes," Josephine observed during one visit in late September. "I don't want to disrupt your home completely." "It's becoming our home," Blake corrected her, "and these aren't disruptions but improvements. The house has always felt unfinished somehow. Now I understand why." The wedding took place on the first Saturday in November, a crisp, clear day with golden leaves carpeting the churchyard. The ceremony was simple but elegant, with Catherine serving as maid of honor and Blake's foreman, Hank, as best man. Josephine wore a dress of her own design, ivory silk with subtle embroidery and seed pearls, complemented by a lace veil that had belonged to her grandmother. When Blake saw her walking down the aisle on the arm of Dr. Reynolds, who had offered to give her away in her father's absence, his expression of wonder and love nearly undid her composure. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but the meaning behind them, the promise of partnership, respect, and enduring love, transcended conventional understanding. The celebration afterward at the town hall included nearly everyone in Walla Walla, many curious to witness this unexpected union. Blake, typically uncomfortable in large social gatherings, remained steadfastly by Josephine's side, his quiet presence a source of strength and comfort. "They're still whispering," Josephine noted as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "Let them," Blake replied, his arms secure around her. "In time they'll find something else to discuss. And if they don't, then we'll give them something truly scandalous to talk about." His eyes twinkled with rare mischief. "Perhaps you'll run for town council when women get the vote." Josephine laughed, drawing curious glances from nearby dancers. "With you as my campaign manager? With me as your most ardent supporter in all things." His expression grew serious. "Always, Josephine." They departed that evening for a brief honeymoon in Portland, where Blake had business with his cattle buyers and Josephine could visit the larger fabric merchants. Even in this, they found compatible interests rather than separate pursuits, each taking genuine pleasure in the other's excitement and knowledge. Their return to Crescent Ridge in late November marked the beginning of their life together, a partnership that quickly proved as productive as it was loving. Josephine's organizational skills complemented Blake's practical knowledge, allowing the ranch to operate with greater efficiency. She maintained a small dressmaking business, accepting only the most challenging or interesting commissions, while Alina thrived in her new role overseeing the household gardens and assisting with the accounts. By their first anniversary, Josephine was expecting their first child, a development that brought Blake to his knees when she told him, his strong hands gentle as they rested against her still flat abdomen. "A family," he whispered, looking up at her with wonder. "Our family. Are you pleased?" She asked, running her fingers through his hair. "Beyond words." He rose to embrace her carefully. "Though I worry for your health, the doctor will attend you regularly, of course, and I have Alina and Mrs. Weaver fussing over me constantly." She smiled against his chest. "I'm healthy and strong, Blake. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Not my child, not with my wife." His protective instincts, usually well controlled, emerged fully during her pregnancy, much to Josephine's mingled exasperation and amusement. Their son, James, was born in August 1878, a healthy baby with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined expression. Blake proved to be an attentive father, often carrying the infant in a sling while he worked around the ranch house, much to the delight of Mrs. Weaver and the bewilderment of some of the ranch hands. "Never seen a man so taken with a baby," Hank commented to Josephine one afternoon as they watched Blake showing little James the horses from a safe distance. "Blake doesn't concern himself much with what men typically do," Josephine replied, pride evident in her voice. "He focuses on what matters." The years that followed brought both expected joys and unforeseen challenges. Their family grew with the addition of a daughter, Alina Catherine, in 1880, and another son, Thomas, in 1883. The ranch prospered under their joint management, expanding to include improved breeding stock and experimental crops that Blake had researched extensively. Josephine maintained her connections with Catherine and the women's suffrage movement, hosting discreet meetings at the ranch and contributing articles to suffrage publications under a pseudonym. When Washington Territory finally granted women the vote in 1883, though it would be revoked and later reinstated, Blake accompanied Josephine to the polls, standing proudly as she cast her ballot. "What do you think your father would say about this day?" she asked as they rode home. Blake considered the question seriously. He was a traditional man in many ways, but he valued fairness above all. I think he would have come to see the justice in it, especially watching you these past years, seeing how your intelligence and judgment benefit our family and community. Their unconventional marriage became less remarkable over time as more women in Walla Walla found their voices, inspired in part by Josephine's example. Young couples occasionally sought their advice, drawn by the evident respect and affection that characterized their relationship even after years together. The secret, Blake would tell them with his rare smile, is to listen more than you speak, and to mean every word when you do speak. And to choose the right partner from the start, Josephine would add, her hand finding his. Someone who sees your true self and values it, even when others don't. In the spring of 1886, 10 years after their first meaningful conversation at Founder's Day, Blake and Josephine stood on the ridge behind their home, watching their children play in the garden below under Aliner's watchful eye. The ranch had grown considerably, now encompassing over 2,000 acres with a reputation for quality that extended beyond the territory. "Do you ever regret it?" Blake asked suddenly, his arm secure around her waist. "Marrying the quiet rancher instead of a town gentleman?" Josephine looked up at him in surprise. "What brings this question after all these years? Thinking about how different your life might have been. You could have had fine things, social position in a bigger city, fewer hard days of work and worry." She turned to face him fully, her hands coming to rest on his chest. At 44, Blake's hair showed touches of silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but he remained as handsome to her as on their wedding day. "I have exactly the life I want, Blake Irwin. With exactly the man I want." She reached up to touch his face. "Those town gentlemen offered hollow compliments and expected conformity in return. You offered honest words and partnership," she smiled. "Besides, I believe I have quite fine things. A beautiful home, healthy children, work that matters, and a husband who still looks at me as if I hung the moon. Because you did." He bent to kiss her, still careful of propriety even after years of marriage. "For me, at least." As they walked back down to join their family, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. All those rejections that had once seemed like failures now appeared as necessary steps leading her to Blake. The whispers and judgments that had once hurt now seemed insignificant against the reality of their life together. She had been rejected by every suitor in town, only to find that the quiet cowboy who proposed had meant every word and continued to mean them, day after day, year after year. In the end, it wasn't about being chosen by many, but being truly seen by the one who mattered most.